Uh, Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Domenico Lombardi from CG, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event on Ukraine. It's not the first time that we co-organize with our friends at the Atlantic Council here an event on Ukraine. Indeed, Ukraine is very close to our heart at CG in Canada, and of course is very close to the heart of my dear colleague Anders Haslund, who's really been the driving force behind today's event. I must confess that when I think about Ukraine, the last thing that comes to my mind is why progress on IMF structural conditionality has been mixed. Rather, the first thing that really comes to my mind is how Ukrainian policymakers could attain a minimum set of policy conditions under uniquely challenging circumstances. And when I was on the ground, when I was in Ukraine, I could observe the determination of a number of senior policymakers in Kiev. And Governor Gontareva, of course, is one of those very few. And another feature that I observed was also the extraordinary degree of participation from civil society. Reforms are painful, maybe in Ukraine are more painful than somewhere else, but really I think what I got from that experience was, participation from civil society is really the key feature in order for Ukraine to advance on the reform agenda going forward. Let me stop here. I will turn now over to my colleague and friend Anders, whom I want to thank for setting this up. He will introduce Governor Gontareva, and then he will be moderating the ensuing panel discussion. Anders, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Domenico, and I want to say that it's a true pleasure to do this together with my old friend Domenico Lombardi and CIG, and of course both for Canada and for the United States. Ukraine is important. It is a central country that we really care about. And personally, I've dealt with Ukraine for 30 years, and I've never seen a head of a central bank in Ukraine who has really done the job, and who have done the job extremely well. So I'm very happy to welcome Valeria Hontarieva here today. And she has been on this job since June 2014. In that period, half of the Ukrainian banks have been closed down. It might sound a bad thing to you, but when you have to think of the banking practices in Ukraine that you will hear more about. The best way of robbing a bank is to own a bank, because you might put up 8% of the assets in capital, and then you take 80% of the loans from the bank, and then you have gained 10 times the money. No bad deal. And what happens with the rest? Well, the central bank is, of course, supposed to pay back or deposit a guarantee fund, or in fact, the depositors might be the case. So this is a tough thing to do, and people do not necessarily see who is responsible and who is right or wrong. Therefore, I think that Ukraine has been very happy to have a Governor Hontarieva who knows what is right and wrong and who's tough enough to carry it out. I should say that before she got this job, she had 20 years of experience in international and Ukrainian finance, the last period before as head of ING in Ukraine. Valeria, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Very happy to see all of you here. And I can tell you that it's very symbolic that just 1 hour ago I met Stanley Fischer. Everybody knows maybe about Stanley Fischer, and and he recalled me our meeting 3 years ago when I just joined the central bank as a governor and visited Washington and met Stanley Fischer here. And when I describe all problems which I faced that time, and when I describe that absolutely incredible collected disbalances which happened with our country before, when I describe the real wartime in our territory and ask his advice, because I knew that he was the governor of the Israeli central bank, and Israel was always in a wartime, and I asked his advice about even military budget and what should be done in Ukraine with all of that, because this war was absolutely not envisaged in our balance, in our budget. This war was absolutely incredible, real bloody war in our territory. And when I counted all this problem with banking sector, after and asked his advice, I remember he answered, mission impossible. And just today, I met him 1 hour ago by chance. And he said, yes, Valeria, mission completed, mission was possible. And it's very, very symbolic for me personally. Because right now I will tell you what was done in Ukraine during these 3 years. But again, I'd like to start from the starting point, what's happened when I joined the central bank. We call this time as a perfect storm. And I do not want to wish to any one of my peers around the world to meet such challenges in their life. More to that, if some of them will meet face such problems, I can recommend to contact immediately National Bank of Ukraine, because right now I can tell you that we are one of the best experts in all these absolutely draconical administrative measures. That's why it's quite unique, but frankly speaking, it could be needed for someone in such a difficult situation. And I'd like to recall what's happened in Ukraine even before Revolution of Dignity. Of course, because we are like a macroeconomists, I will be talking just only about economy and about macro figures, not about any political developments. First of all, Ukraine met end of 2013 with absolutely incredible deficit of current account. It was 10% current account deficit. And the former President Yanukovych government supported absolutely artificial foreign exchange local currency rate through absolutely enormous intervention. They spent about $23 billion to support peg US dollar rate, local currency peg US dollar rate. It was absolutely not sustainable anymore. And that's why, all this problem and all these disbalances, it was already the real bricks of precipice. It's not anymore, it could blow up even without any revolution of dignity, because from a macroeconomic point of view, it was a real disaster, verge of disaster. And these collected disbalances happened not only just, for example, in financial sector. It was everywhere. You can recall and understand about that, for example, deficit and quasi-sovereign deficit. We can recall deficit in our NAC Naftogaz gas monopoly. You cannot even maybe imagine, we have absolutely zero treasury accounts of our government that time. It was just a disaster. And finally, we immediately started to react. First of all, and our main achievements during these 3 years, it's a macro-financial stability. And it was very difficult to find, because we switched to flexible exchange rate, but believe me, it was very difficult to find equilibrium. It was very difficult to find this current level of our exchange when we really not only collected disbalances, which I already described to you, but when we lost, first of all, we lost 3.6% of our GDP. It was annexion of Crimea. We lost more than 2 million of our population. And from a macroeconomic point of view, you understand, you lost GDP, but your debt to GDP is still with you. Your debt with you, but GDP is not. And after what happened with, and we could more or less survive even in these circumstances, but in August and September 2014, real war started in our eastern part. Our eastern part, we lost not just 10% of our territory at that time. We lost 15% of our GDP and 30% of our export revenues. You could imagine current account of any country which in one day lost 30% of GDP. And 30% of your 15% of GDP and 30% of export revenues. And of course it was a real disaster. And in that time we had no any reserves to keep our peg to US dollar exchange rates. That's why we try to find equilibrium. And of course, together with all international community, together with IMF, together with World Bank, with EBRD, and all other supporters, European Union as well, we stabilize the situation. Right now, you can observe that 2 years in a row, we have absolutely stable macro-financial environment. And you know that stable macro-financial environment, it's a must. It's a first basement to do any further development of business, portfolio investments, or direct investments to our country. That's why our macro-financial stability already there. More to that, what we did else? In the beginning of last year, we launched absolutely brand new monetary policy in Ukraine. It's inflation targeting monetary policy. Right now, if you even consider that 3 years ago you could even dream about inflation targeting, of course you could be treated like a dreamer. But now it's a reality. Last year we announced a 12% inflation target. Maybe for someone who looks like how inflation target could be 12%. But for us, after inflation of 43% in 2015, 12% target was absolutely challenging target, and we reached this target. Last year, our inflation was 12.4. And this year, our target is 8 plus minus 2%, and we are absolutely sure that we will reach 9%. According to our forecast right now, our inflation will be 9%. It's still in range, like 8 plus minus 2. And next year, our inflation forecast 6. And in 2019, our inflation will be 5. For the time being, 5, we consider that it's a very good level for Ukraine to reach. And after that, we're absolutely sure that absolutely new life in banking sector and financial sector you will really observe. And maybe after that, management board of central bank will consider inflation like in other countries, like a 2%, or maybe other countries will switch to other mode, because you know right now a lot of discussion about this 2% inflation target for central banks. Sometimes it's even considered that it could be higher. And more to that. You understand that we could not even dream about inflation targeting a monetary regime without some prerequisites. And these prerequisites, it's joint efforts of government and national bank, how we reach all these prerequisites. First of all, we stop fiscal dominance. if someone right now among my peers in other central banks discussing idea of helicopter money, they can immediately call to Central Bank of Ukraine because we can share with them how it works. Ukraine was in helicopter money more than 20 years in a row. It was just how we call fiscal dominance when the central bank was the printing machine of local currency which supply our budget through different type of instruments, and of course we stop this practice. But to stop this practice, we should balance the budget of the country. Without balancing of budget, we could not even imagine how we will stop this fiscal dominance. Because in first year, in 2014, we could not stop it. Because as I described you in the beginning, for example, military expenditure in 2014, because nobody envisaged any military expenditure because war happened in the middle of 2014. More to that, all these huge disbalances in NAC Naftogaz. It was also not envisaged, nobody envisaged it in the budget, but it was a reality because somehow without normal gas reform, normal gas market prices for gas, it was just incredible disbalances in a balance, of course, of NAC Naftogaz and in a budget, state budget as well. That's why we stopped fiscal dominance. We already, energy reform, first stage of energy reform already happened before that. And also we prepare all needed instruments, market open instruments, and also all our research capacity. We prepare all our analytical capacity to start inflation targeting. And we started, and we are very proud of that. I'd like also to highlight you about the reform of banking sector. I can tell you that we start all reforms in parallel. We understand that it's impossible to start on just reform in, for example, monetary policy, and after in one day to consider reform in banking sector. We started all reform in parallel. That's why monetary policy reform and banking sector cleanup. How to tell you what I observe in the banking sector when if I start to tell you the story, you will think that it's a thriller. It's not a reality because it was just a disaster. And insolvency and illiquidity is the best I can tell you because it's a banking terms. All other, it's like a money laundering machine, mafia, organized mafia, non-transparent ownership of this banking institution, and it's just absolutely absolutely awful situation. And what we did, we start real, very deep diagnostic study. And this diagnostic study, it's two parts of this study. First of all, it's asset quality review plus stress test. And right now, I'm very proud to tell you that IMF even recommended other emerging markets to take our example like a role model for other central banks to start deep diagnostic analysis of their banking sector. And we started from the biggest 20 banks, and after next 20 banks, and after that next 20 banks. That's why right now it's already 60 banks. 60 banks in Ukraine right now represent 98% of banking sector. That's why we still have 40 banks, but all of them represent only 2% of Ukrainian banking systems. That's why it's absolutely not dangerous anymore. And I can tell you that we fully clean up Ukrainian banking system. And we reach agreement with IMF that recapitalization of Ukrainian banks will have quite a special mechanism. And right now I will explain to you how, because you know, Ukrainian banks and Ukrainian economy was hit by all this real war, depreciation of 3 times depreciation of local currency, And of course, all these devils happened with us. Frankly speaking, during 2014 and 2015, it was minus 20% of our GDP. And it was even, all of that had even negative hit for more or less good and stable Ukrainian banks. That's why we agreed with IMF special program. And for financial experts, it will be maybe very interesting to hear that first time in a life, in a financial life, we agreed that recapitalization of bank could be done during 4 years time, 4 years horizon. First year, our banks committed to reach 0% capital adequacy. What does it mean? If we provided them 1 year to reach 0 capital adequacy ratio, now I can tell you, because it's not dangerous anymore, because all of them reach already 0 capital adequacy ratio, that when you have negative capital, it means that you insolvent, you are bankrupt. But it means all Ukrainian banks that time were with negative capital. And of course, we have a special program to reach 0% capital adequacy, after 5% capital adequacy, next 7% capital adequacy next year, and we will reach 10% capital adequacy ratio only to the end of 2018. Means that it's a program. One of the biggest problem of Ukrainian banking sector was related party lending. It was absolutely incredible story, and we will discuss with you today. We call this oligarch banking model. And of course, we also understood this problem in the beginning. And that's why we also agreed that we will set up 3 years program for elimination, very partial, of course, elimination and of all these related parties during 3, not a partial, full elimination during these 3 years, but it will be absolutely monthly installments, when all these shareholders should repay their related party loans. That's why it was like a compromise. It was initially because when someone criticized us for doing something immediately in 1 day, believe me, it's absolutely not a reality. 4 years for recapitalization and 3 years for elimination of related party loans. It was an initial arrangement which we agreed with IMF and after signed and agreed with Ukrainian banks. What we did else? I'm very proud to tell you that right now, 100% ownership of Ukrainian banking system already there. When I joined central bank, it was only 40% of banks which we could understand who is the owner of these banks. And believe me, we do not, if we right now compare what National Bank is understand about UBOs, we never understand that any representative of trust companies or very specific SPVs of Cyprus with very specific Greek names will never treat them like UBOs. And that's why we immediately started to ask the proofs about the real UBOs. And I say I will recommend to all my peers in other central banks to follow these rules, because know your customers, know real UBO of these particular companies and business. And I can tell you that you can find information in Ukrainian National Bank website when all 100 UBOs of all banks already there. And that's why transparent ownership, all these diagnostic studies, transactions with related parties, we already, and finally, we clean up Ukrainian banking system. And we sent to DGF depository, guarantee depository fund, about 87 Ukrainian banks which did not deliver their capital according to agreed schedule, or some banks, for example, 20 banks among these 87 were not banks. It was just money laundering machine. It was just an institution for money laundering and nothing more. And we already completely stopped the practice of so-called oligarch banking. Oligarch banking model was very, very easy one. You, not you, but of course oligarch, try to find and to absorb resources from all possible channels. The biggest channel for oligarchs were private individual deposits. For example, in PrivatBank, which we nationalized before end of last year, 33%. 33, I'm not joking, it's 33% of private individual deposits of Ukraine were sitting in this particular bank. And other sources were, for example, it could be sources like individual, different type of accounts, from business accounts, of course, legal entities. Also sources, even refinancing of the central bank in normal way for all these people. I'm talking about the legacy and history. And also, for example, Eurobonds. In PrivatBank, you can observe when we did nationalization, we did already bail-in of Eurobond holder, because even Eurobonds or shareholder of PrivatBank use Eurobonds for all this. And after they start to build pyramids, they invested money to their own business, and their investment, they really created absolutely incredible, huge portfolio of related parties. Or somehow, for example, Privat is a very good example of that. They just siphon money abroad and created absolutely not a real business portfolio, but just shelf companies for like fixtures, absolutely fraudulent portfolio. And that's why, you know, when we announced nationalization of PrivatBank, we already showed to our country the real picture. It was capital shortage was minus 146 billion hryvnias. It's approximately $5.6 billion that time. But in historical figures, of course, it's more, because we use right now the exchange rate of 26, but understanding that all these wrongdoings happened with this bank not yesterday, and in historical horizon, of course, you can see even bigger figures at 5.6. More to that. Very soon will be ready a post-audit of this particular bank. And management of this bank and supervisor of this bank already contacted us and said that it's not finished the story. They need some additional capital. And very soon, to the end of this month, this audit will be published. That's why we will see the real figures. But believe me, because I already saw some preliminary result, it will be also very sizable additional capital injection which our country should spend for this particular bank. But even if we're talking about these figures like 5.6 billion, for you to understand the magnitude of these figures, 33% of private individual deposits, but you can tell, yes, private individual deposits, we have no idea how these deposits in the country. But for you to understand the magnitude, this 146 billion hryvnia, it's a 50% of our monetary base. That's why for understand comparison between our real economy, Ukrainian figures, and the real particular fraud in this bank, just a 50% of Ukrainian monetary base. And that's why it's absolutely incredible. But finally, we nationalized this bank because it was systemically important. And no doubts that that time it was only one possible way, even if it's very costly for the state. We save 20 million depositors, 20 million private individual depositors, 20 million. And 18 million of active credit cards. It was also all cards of this 600,000 SME, small and medium-sized businesses. That's why we have absolutely no other choice but to nationalize this particular bank. And with nationalization of this bank, I can tell you that real revamp and real turnaround exercise for Ukrainian banking system cleanup was like a 60%. Because without, of course, number-wise, it's like a 50%, but asset-wise, with nationalization of Privat, it was like a 60%. And it's a reality, and it was a very painful exercise, but it's a reality. Our banking sector already cleaned up. Our banking system already really liquid. Right now we have a spare liquidity on local currency more than 100 billion hryvnia of spare liquidity on local currency. We have spare liquidity on foreign currency more than $5 billion right now. That's why our sector already cleaned up and ready to start lending. And as I already described you, our macro environment, it's a stable macro situation. More to that, it's absolutely predictable. We expect 2% GDP growth and this year, and we expect 9% inflation. We expect even next year that growth will accelerate it more. And our banking sector is clean, and our banking sector is ready to start lending. And what else? Of course, maybe a few words about internal transformation of the central bank. In parallel, immediately we started also internal transformation of central bank, because if you clean up any banking sector, but you not really set up proper supervision, later on in few years you again will face the same music like before. That's why proper risk-based supervision was also a priority for the central bank. More to that, you cannot set up proper monetary policy without real transformation of the central bank in this field. That's why we did, how recently, you remember, Vlad, it was IMF report that was written that it's remarkable transformation, internal transformation of the central bank. Of course, and we are very proud of internal transformation. We not just cut 60% of our personnel, because when I joined central bank it was 12,000 people, right now it's 5, and our next destination in 3-year times it's 2,000 people. That's why, but 2,000, it's our target only if we do proper automatization of all processes. Right now it was a different exercise, but going the road, we need to do some automatization of processes. And that's why I think it's time. You show me that it's time. And of course, we'll be ready to answer all your questions. Thank you very much.
Susan, let's move up. You see where? Сюда.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. I think that was quite a forceful presentation. And let me first introduce the whole panel, and then I will pose a couple of questions to each of you. Closest to my left here, I have Dan Bilak, who's Canadian-Ukrainian. He has been living ever since '91 when Ukraine became independent, and been working as a commercial lawyer in Kiev. But last year, after Prime Minister Groisman had been appointed, he decided that it was time to try to help the Ukrainian government with to attract foreign investments. And Francis Malish is managing director for EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, with responsibility for Ukraine, but not only, for the region around. And he has an office of 80 people. EBRD is the biggest investor in Ukraine. And I should also say that Francis Malish is board member of PrivatBank after the nationalization. So you can guess what I will ask him about. And last but not least, Susan Shadler, who has been a long-term staff member of the International Monetary Fund. She was towards the end, deputy director for the European Department, and from the IMF side, she has dealt extensively and repeatedly with Ukraine, and now she's a senior fellow of CG. So let me start with you, Francis. The big topic, of course, now on banking and Ukraine, it is PrivatBank. Bank, and you joined immediately as a member of a supervisory board after the nationalization. And a big question, the governor here raised it, $5.6 billion disappeared to the former owners of PrivatBank. Can you get the money back, or what can you do about it?
Well, we can certainly try. When money disappears like this, it's always difficult to get the money back because, unfortunately, I have this to say about the legal profession is that the better lawyers work for the bad guys generally. And so it's going to be a difficult task.
I'll try not to take that personally.
That's ahead of us. I said generally, there's exceptions. But no, just to take a step back, if someone, because we have the pleasure of being here also with the Center for International Governance Innovation, if someone needs to be convinced what can happen in a bank with no governance or bad governance, and look no further than PrivatBank and look no further than the Ukrainian banking system. As you said in your introductory remarks, it's actually much easier to rob a bank once you own it, and you make much more money out of it than having a gun and sitting outside the branch. And this is clearly a case where governance has been misused and abused. If you follow Ukraine, you will have seen that a few months before nationalization, an article appeared in Business New Europe with a detail of the loan portfolio of PrivatBank. And at the time, I didn't know the detail, but I read the article. And if you show me or my team in Ukraine any loan portfolio of any of the large Ukrainian banks, I will know the names. And I was reading this article, and I saw a loan portfolio with not one single name I could recognize. And then when the central bank nationalized it, and they said 97% of the loan portfolio is related party lending, well, that squares. Simply means that there was actually very few real loans in that loan portfolio on the corporate side. Of course, there's also a small and medium business and the individual side to that loan portfolio. Now, going back to your question about the whole, the bank was nationalized as a result. It was the right thing to do, absolutely. I was particularly pleased, using Ukraine as a benchmark again, that a few days later, headline article appeared in Bloomberg saying Ukraine shows Italy how to do a bailout. I'd rather see it that way than the other way around. So that's well done, Governor. But there's no question that it's a teamwork. It's a long effort. It's teamwork to get such an amount back. It's about the bank restructuring these loans. It's about the sovereign going after when that needs to be done. I'm not, frankly, at the liberty to speculate how much the shareholder will live by, or the shareholders will live by the commitments that they've made to the Ukrainian government. And I know it's a big, especially in this city, something that people look at a lot, but I'm not going to be tweeting what the next move is. But let me tell you, there's a negotiation ongoing. We hired advisors, actually last week, to help negotiate with the former shareholders. If that negotiation works, then it works. If it doesn't, there's other options on the table.
Yeah, thank you. And Dan, for you, what does this banking sector mean to you? Do you trust Governor Hontarieva now, that now she has cleaned up the bank so that you can advise foreign investors to use Ukrainian banks? Or how do you go about it?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Anders. It's an excellent question. What I always invite foreign investors to consider from the beginning is the scale of the disaster that Ukraine was and the train wreck that it was in 2014. Governor Hontareva, with characteristic humility, talked about the efforts in the NBU. The NBU was a microcosm of what was going on in the rest of the country. And, you know, I get the fact that there are problems. I've been living and working in Ukraine for 25 years. I'm as aware of them as anybody. But the fact of the matter is that we only started building a country 3 years ago. I think that the takeaway from this presentation is for 23 years, Ukraine was ruled by a kleptocratic Soviet nomenclatura elite that basically treated the country and the state treasury as a trough. And we see it all coming out now. And the fact that Ukraine is even alive and surviving and growing today is quite amazing, given where it was in 2014. And I think from a governance perspective, which is how I really look at this, is, you know, we're still in this period of massive transformation. I mean, it's seismic. At the same time as we are deconstructing Soviet-era institutions, we are trying to build the institutions of modern democratic governance. I mean, there's no manual for how you do this stuff, and it really hasn't been done anywhere before. And when you look at when you look at this in these terms, you say to yourself, "Wow, you know, what is going on here?" And you say, "Yeah, okay, there's corruption. We have this problem. We have these issues with the law enforcement agencies and the courts, etc." But then when you start looking at the trend and the people that went into government, left business and cushy jobs to go and dedicate their lives to actually rebuilding the country, they stabilized it. They put it, you know, we got from crisis to stability. And now I think with, you know, the Prime Minister announced last week 5 key reforms for this year that are really going to drive the country, should drive the country further. I mean, we had, in the fourth quarter of 2016, we had 4.7% growth year on year. That's a phenomenal statistic. And when you translate this into the banking sector, and as I said, I'm a lowly lawyer. I'm not smart enough to be an economist or a banker. But when you look at this from a perspective of investment, there's two things that investors look for. One is buying a bank, coming in and entering the market, and then working with Ukrainian banks in order to provide your investment. And, you know, one thing I think that comes out is that for the banks that I know, the margins are actually quite healthy in Ukraine. There's 5% between deposits and loans. That's a very, I understand that's a very healthy margin. So it's a profitable business to come into because the system has been stabilized. There's now clarity. There's now you can actually know who you're dealing with and what's going on beyond these banks. So the fact that there is this culture of compliance that has entered the system is absolutely fundamental to stabilizing the rest of the reforms that take place across government. And so by having improved and stabilized the macro situation, it's allowing a lot of other things to develop and grow. And this is all about renewing trust and legitimacy in institutions, because we're building new institutions. It's not about reforming. You cannot reform most of the institutions we inherited. You have to destroy them and rebuild. But you have an economy. You have this is things that really affect people's lives on a daily basis too. So there are very strong political considerations and socioeconomic considerations. One of the difficulties, of course, is everybody points to the NPLs. We've got about 50% of the bank
non-performing loans.
Non-performing loans. But most of these were done in 2007 to 2009. The new loans that are being booked are being done under this new regime, under the regulatory regime that the NBU put into place in the last 3 years. So again, perhaps, you know, there were clients of mine that were buying banks out of administration, because then the NBU took them in after 2014. They started cleaning them up. They started to look at what was going on, and then you could understand. You could understand what it is that you were buying. And one of my clients, a very large agro holding, bought a bank out of administration and has turned it into a farm lending operation that has been very successful. When you talk about lending alongside, very briefly, again, it's a compliance issue. And I treat foreign banks the same as Ukrainian banks. They're all subject to the same regulations. So you have banks such as Raiffeisen, Bank, which is part of BNP Bank Paribas, that are now lending in hryvnias. at 10 or 12% over 5-year terms. This was unheard of before. And it shows that the liquidity, that there are now mechanisms to get this liquidity back in the system to start to try to juice the economy in order for small, medium-sized businesses, foreign investors to be able to take that money and apply it in a sensible fashion. The real problem at the end of the day is not with the regulator, or it's not with the structure of the bank. The real problem is with property rights. Until Ukraine, and we are working on this in the government, securing the property rights of investors through the courts, through proper creditors' rights provisions, and we're working on a project with the EBRD right now with Francis on this. And so the trend is actually very good. And when investors see this, they see Ukraine in a very different light than what they might read in the media.
Thank you. Susan Shadler, you have dealt with the old oligarchic elite as I have for a long time. Do you buy this story? Is Ukraine really that reformed as we have heard now? Or would you take a more skeptical view of the whole thing?
Well, I have to tell you, I feel like my role here is to be more skeptical, so I fit into it really easily, having spent so many years at the IMF, and it comes as second nature. The way I see Ukraine over the last 3 years is, I'm going to give you a phenomenal story of success in some respects, and the kinds of hurdles that the IMF sees in many countries that don't make it for a long, long time. So there is no question that Ukraine is not out of the woods. There are two components when the IMF looks at a country like Ukraine. Number one is stabilization. 2014 was a total crisis. And the first task is to stabilize, to get things, macroeconomic stability in place. And it's a pretty easy, I mean, the experience has taught the IMF a lot about the basics that are necessary to get this stability. It really requires getting the government to buy into it and understand it. And frankly, the central bank, more than anything, at this stage is the most important. There are three components to the stability. This is very 10,000 feet, but basically this is how the IMF operates, and I think successfully. Number one, you got to have a flexible exchange rate. Over time, inflation targeting a flexible exchange rate. Over time, that's a huge buffer, the capacity for the exchange rate to move without startling markets because it has a history of moving. And that's a huge protective buffer of any country against crisis. The second is cleaning up the banking system. As long as you have a banking system riddled with all these non-performing loans and dicey ownership and so forth, you're never going to get stability. You might get temporary periods of stability, but it's not going to be stability. So the banking system's the second, and the fiscal situation is the third. If a government is racking up a lot of debt, eventually lenders are going to say, yeah, we've got enough of your debt, and then that's a crisis. So what Ukraine has done is addressed all three of these aspects of stability, and lo and behold, it's a reasonably stable looking situation if you put growth on one side. So that's great. And if Ukraine can keep those conditions in place, then there probably won't be crises, or the risk of crisis is pretty low. It will be on a sustained basis. The second part of what the IMF would like to look at is how do you get growth going again? How do you get investment? How do you get employment? How do you stop immigration? How do you get the working age population to work? And this is where the IMF is not actually all that good. Not because of any real shortcoming of the IMF itself, but it's a very hard process, and it takes a huge amount of political buy-in, which, as opposed to talking to the central bank and trying to persuade the central bank that here are some things that have to get done for stability, this sort of structural reform business is really hard. It requires a huge amount of political maneuvering to get people to accept it. And this is where, Ukraine is at a very early stage at best of making progress. And the story over the last 3 years has been a lot of missed so-called structural performance criteria, which are the IMF's conditions for its loans that are related to getting growth going again. So, for example, in the review that was just completed so that the IMF could disperse a tranche of its commitment to Ukraine, there were 11 structural benchmarks. These are the structural conditions that the country has to meet, and 8 of them were rescheduled to some future time. So this is the kind of messy stage where things can easily fall apart. And I think that's where...
But let me counter there. We all remember the Indonesian financial crisis in 97, 98. Then the lesson afterwards was that the IMF posed too many structural demands, and we are sort of seeing this mission creep with regard to the IMF in Ukraine. You can say that the IMF is the strongest international financial organization, but it's not, as you rightly point out, it's not very good on the broader development issues.
It's not very good, but
because
its shareholders keep pushing it. Because when they look at a country like Greece, like Ukraine, these are the 2 big ones right now.
Well, Greece is no major success.
Why don't we see growth? What's going on? Why are things not coming right? And so the IMF says, well, you know, the conditions, structural conditions for growth just aren't there. So they say, well, get them fixed, you know, like go out and do something about this. So it's a little unfair on the IMF. The IMF goes through cycles on this. I mean, about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a big push saying, too much structural conditionality. The fund doesn't even know what it's talking about half the time, and they're holding up productive disbursement of funds. Mm-hmm. But then along came Greece, which had huge structural problems, and I was saying, why don't you put some structural conditions on the country and make sure they do this stuff before you disperse the funds? And so then you got to swing back to, yeah, the fund's feet are being held to the fire by its main stakeholders.
Well, we don't have any representative of the World Bank here, which is supposed to do all these structural things. But Francis, you are doing part of it, but more in the private sector. How do you see your part in this structural reform discussion?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to point out to point us in the direction of the private sector on this, because in fact what we see in Ukraine now is. As the governor said, there's this saying in English that says they didn't know it was impossible, therefore they did it. Well, in her case, she knew it was impossible, and nevertheless she did it. So that's fixed. But what needs to be fixed now is for the Ukrainian elite, frankly, to realize that investors have a choice. When I'm in Kiev, that's most of the time, and I listen to people speak, they all say, my country needs this, my country needs that, and so on. But there's very little discourse around, and how do I make my country attractive to investors? As they say in my language, you don't catch flies with vinegar, right? So if you have 10 different sorts of produce to land a ship in Yuzhny or Odessa when you have 3 in Rotterdam, and if it costs you 3 times as much in Yuzhny as it does in Constanta, you know what? The Black Sea is a Black Sea. It doesn't cost you more to go to Constanta than to go to Yuzhny, right? So that's how we need to think, and that's how we're encouraging the government to think, because there's a tendency in every country to say we need to kickstart growth, we need investment, let's have huge projects with the government as a sponsor. But that's missing the point. The real point, the real power is unleashing the power of the private sector. And how do we do this? Well, by building a better business environment. So we do this at EBRD with a focus on the private sector. One of the recent things we did was to create a new framework for banks to be able to restructure loans. Because a banker is by nature someone maybe not as smart as a lawyer, but cautious, and who's going to say, why am I going to lend money if there's no way I can get my money back if things go wrong? And that is the case in Ukraine today. That used to be the case. So there's a new law now where banks can actually restructure loans out of court. And that's great because it means that the entrepreneur solves the situation earlier and the banker solves the situation earlier. We have a lot of non-performing loans on the banking system. I'm not too worried. The main reason why we have so many non-performing loans is because we've not been lending. If you stop lending in a bank, after a while, what's left in your loan portfolio is only the impaired loans, because the others have reimbursed. So, you know, at the end, if you close a bank, you have 100% non-performing loans after a few years, right? So the best way to resolve this issue with non-performing loans is not to focus on the percentage, which is high, but is focus on the amount, which is not growing. And that's the piece of good news that that I see in the system. Now, to get banks to start lending again, well, we see some of it. We can accelerate. I think the good conditions that are starting to come is macroeconomic stability. Why would banks lend to an SME at 15% if they can lend to the government at 16%? Doesn't take much analysis, doesn't take much follow-up, doesn't take much monitoring. You can lend to the government at 16, so why would you bother, right? So as soon as the macroeconomic stability will enable to bring the interest rates further down, you will see that banks will suddenly become a bit more interested in lending to the real economy. What you need to see as well is capital markets development. The capital markets are underdeveloped, so we're working with the central bank, we're working with the Securities and Exchange Commission in Ukraine to modernize the capital markets. That's also very important. We need to see land reform. Why? Because in Ukraine you've got about 50, I think it's 36 million hectares of agricultural land at an average value of 1,000 to 1,500 euros or dollars per hectare. That's close to 50 billion collateral that you could bring in a banking system. Today, banks cannot take land as collateral because they can't own it. Only Ukrainian natural persons can own it. Right? The plan for land reform that is being discussed right now does not meet that criteria. It's extremely important, if we want it to be successful, that banks can lend against collateral in the agri-sector. Otherwise, the reform will fail. Okay, and it's still being discussed, so I'm not saying it will fail. I'm saying it's really important that to me is the line at which a reform starts being successful or not being successful. And then finally, I'd like to say, if we want to see resumption of lending in a good way, we need as quickly as possible to see privatization in the banking sector. Right now, we have 55% of the banking sector which is in state banks. A state bank is a bank where a loan officer risks to be put in jail when they renegotiate the principal of a loan. That's no way to do banking, period. So either we change the law and we let them do it, or we privatize these banks, and then they will not be under the focus of the prosecutor general the moment they renegotiate the principal of a loan with a client which is in difficulty. And they will also not have a blanket guarantee on deposits which tilts the playing field. It was introduced, it was necessary as a temporary measure at the time of the PrivatBank nationalization. But we need to see, as quickly as possible, good governance in the banking sector, including in the state banks, so professional boards, independent boards in the state banks, and privatization. And that all of these factors taken together will be building blocks for a much better functioning banking system, and therefore lending to the real economy, and therefore economic growth.
Valeria, let me turn that question to you. What should be done with all these banks that have now been nationalized, and where do you see the new capital into the banking system coming into Ukraine? And let me also then bring up, you have about 20% of banking assets, or until recently, belonging to Russian banks. And you have told the Russian banks, I think a year ago, that they had 2 years to get out of the country. That is the state banks. What is happening with this part of the ownership? What kind of ownership do you see for banks in Ukraine in the future?
First of all, I'd like to add something which Susan told us, that macro financial stability, it's a basement for all other businesses, banking sector. That's why we reached this macro financial stability more than 2 years, and we are still in a very stable situation with very good macro forecast. The main idea, and you are absolutely right, we need to start structural reform. And, but all my colleagues around the world, for example, Mr. Ingvest, he is governor of the Sweden Central Bank. He said that central banks are always like a white knight who start to do this job. And finally we did our part. And of course right now we are sitting and not sitting and waiting. We absolutely agree to help our colleagues right now to do real structural reforms. And it's a health reform, it's education reform, it's a reform of land reform, it's a pension reform. And right now, because as a member of Ukrainian official delegation, I spent 2 days, yesterday we had 2 meetings with the World Bank and with Mr. Kim, World Bank discussion. It's exactly what we're discussion about pension and land reform. And no doubt that we start to implement this reform. No doubt that we'll start to do that very soon. It's not just because we signed our IMF memorandum, which is written about this reform. If you can observe EFF memorandum, you can see that 50% of that dedicated to financial sector. And to our other reforms, it's only maybe a few sentences, for example. But believe me, when reform started, you will observe numerous structural benchmark, not just only, for example, to vote some special law about new pension reform, not. Of course, to vote the law, it's only first time of this reform, after you need to implement everything which already voted in a parliament. That's why implementation phase, it's the most important part. Now I'd like to be back, for example, land reform. We discussed again with World Bank land reform. More to that, sometimes even World Bank would like to adjust their vision of this land reform to like they consider Ukrainian reality. But my personal recommendation to all audience, including World Bank, never to consider and to reinvent special Ukrainian bicycle. We need to implement the best international practice, for example, like we did in Ukrainian banking sector. And don't worry, we have no any special, we're European country in the center of Europe with the same European mentality. That's why don't worry, best international practice, it's a one way, and land reform also should go to this direction. And now back to your question. As Francis mentioned absolutely right, after cleanup of Ukrainian banking system, we face new problem. It's 50% of Ukrainian banking system right now in the hands of the state. State never was the best owner and manager of these banks. I could not disturb you with observation when I saw the books of Ukrainian state banks. You will start to cry because, during last 10 years, $10 billion were injected to capital of these banks. All of them disappear. Not only oligarch banking use these banks for all these siphon money and all this related party lending, because related party means related to shareholders, to whom related all these loans in the banks, state banks portfolios, to political elite of our country during last 20 years. You can observe all these names. It's all of them, not like oligarchs, but somehow politicians. And of course, it's absolutely, we stop all this practice. But nevertheless, NPL portfolio, it's still there. And NPL portfolio, NPL problems, it's not just unique problem for Ukraine. You can observe, for example, Italian banking sector right now in their NPL portfolio. This requires global resolution, what to do with NPLs. But of course, because we have no reform in our judicial system, we need this reform. We started this reform, but unfortunately in the beginning of this process. Because we have still no rule of law, it's very difficult to consider when person in a good mind start to lend again if they could not, withdraw all their collaterals from their previous lending. And of course, we need to clean up all this mess in our judicial system. Our court system reform, it's a priority. It's from my point of view, court system reform, it's a priority. Only when justice in a court will be there, after all judicial reform will start automatically to adjust to the justice on the highest level. That's why court system reform, it's a priority, and after all others. And be back to your question about Russian banks. You know, when a real war started in our territory, for us it was absolutely clear that Russian banks in our territory will not have a rosy future. That's why it was absolutely not a surprise for all of them. And we discussed numerous times with the CEO of all Russian state banks their destiny, and we agreed that they will deleverage their business in Ukraine. And I can tell you that I could not complain for anything wrong doings from their side. During 2 years' time, they decreased their presence in Ukrainian market from 15% to 8%. And frankly speaking, we have agreed plan down the road. But what happened recently, some politicians, again, some so-called nationalists, believe me, nothing may be linked to real nationalists. It's again, some political movements started all this vandalism and unrest. And of course, it was a real damage for Ukrainian banking system, because Russian banks, for us, it means what? Russian capital, state capital in these banks. But you know that last year, when foreign direct investments were equal 3.3 billion, only 1 billion was foreign direct investments. 2.3 billion was debt to equity swap, and biggest part of that, like 90%, it was a debt to equity swap of Russian state banks. And I can explain you why. Why 2.3 billion of capital was injected to these particular banks? Because when they started their activity after the crisis of 2008, the Russian state banks very heavily invested to our industrial part of our country, to Donbass and Lugansk. And after they occupied this territory, and after they physically destroy these assets, and after they pay bill for that. That's why they injected capital, but they injected absolutely in line with our regulation. That's why we'd like also to be absolutely in line with our regulation. And you know, recently they announced some so-called fire sale of their banks, and right now they provided central bank with documents for these potential buyers. And of course we got official documents only from one particular bank, and of course right now we start to do a due diligence. But believe me, it's these three banks with Russian capital, according to your knowledge, all of these banks under international sanctions, after the US sanctions and European. That's why it's very interesting how all these new buyers also could be immediately under sanction, because if you're a European investor or you're American investor, you cannot buy equity of companies under sanctions. But we stabilize the situation. Physical security of these banks today in Ukraine already there. And more to that, we stabilize liquidity position, it's also good. And also central bank also committed to help these banks with liquidity, because this liquidity could not go to Russian shareholders. It could go only for repayments of liabilities to local depositors, to local businesses. That's why don't worry about that. And these banks are solvent, good capitalized and liquid. That's why, of course, we do not foresee any rosy future. We still believe that it should be manageable way of self-liquidation or sale to some other investors.
Thank you very much. It's time to let in the floor. I see lots of hands, so I will take. You have been very anxious here. Please introduce yourself and with name and institution, and
thanks a lot.
Focus on a question.
Vladislav Sidorenko, 1+1 Media, Ukraine. So a lot of words about nationalization and PrivatBank, so my question will be about nationalization and PrivatBank. Some interesting points. Prior to nationalization, the largest bank of Ukraine, the National Bank claimed that 97% of all loans were issued to companies close to the shareholders. So the private bank is a threat to the national system of Ukraine. There was a great scandal. There was a great scandal with the PricewaterhouseCoopers in Ukraine. In their report, they indicated not 97%, as the National Bank claimed, but only 16%, and that the National Bank gives incorrect information. So the National Bank offered to cancel license for PwC in Ukraine. However, after the nationalization of the country's largest bank and the allocation of $5.5 billion, there was held a new tender to another financial audit of the private bank. And that tender won Ernst & Young. So I have a preliminary audit report
in
my hands.
Take a question.
It was yes. It was published this morning. It is written that the losses for which was allocated $5.5 billion and the National Bank spoke before nationalization were not confirmed. So I have two simple questions. Will Ernst & Young have the same pressure as PwC? And the second one, if it's all true, it turns out that it was not nationalization but simply taken. And where did 5.5 billion go?
Okay, may
That's
I
the
start
question.
off?
Please.
Yeah, you see the question. More to that, I'd like to introduce you. Channel 1+1 belong to Mr. Kolomoisky. Bye-bye. And funny, even in the center of Washington, we can observe something like that. And I can tell you that I, representative of supervisory board is sitting here. I can tell you that it's not yet officially published Ernst & Young report. Of course, like a governor of central bank, I already saw the preliminary result. And as I reported to you during my speech, this result is even worse than before. 143 billion, it's not all losses which our state will accrue because of all these wrongdoings and all frauds in these banks. In this bank. PrivatBank last night deal, fraudulent deal in PrivatBank was additional 16 billion hryvnia. And also, of course, my educated guess that the state will inject maybe additional 30 billion hryvnia to this bank, but unfortunately, result of audit you will see soon will show even maybe bigger figure. But of course, we will agree with Minister of Finance when we observe all these figures from Ernst & Young. And after we will decide what exact amount we will put to this bank, it will be to the end of this month. But again, you see how it works in Ukraine. Welcome to the club.
Andrei Sitov, TASS. Microphone.
Not in your club, okay?
Thank you. I'm sorry. I will try to stand up briefly. Thank you for doing this. Thank you to the Atlantic Council, to Anders, and thank you, Valeria Alexeyevna, for coming over and talking to us. Basically, you have answered my question in your answer to Anders. Basically a follow-up, a small follow-up is formally the sanctions against the Russian banks were introduced on the pretext of national security. So what specifically what rules, what threats in terms of national security did they present to the national security of your country? Thank you.
Sanction, you mean sanction against Russian state banks, which were recently introduced? It was just it was a sanction which not allowed Russian banks to pay interbank financing to their mother's company. It's a very limited sanction. This sanction does not, negatively influence the business of local business of local subsidiary of these banks in Ukraine. This sanction allowed us to stabilize the situation because it was absolutely clear when after the vandalism which happened already to preserve stability of these banks, when bank run started, to explain to all our depositors that all money available within this bank will not be repaid abroad to Russian state banks, to shareholders, but will stay within the banks in the territory of Ukraine. That's why it will be timely paid deposits. And that's why we introduced this sanction for 1 year only to stabilize the situation and to prevent negative effect for financial stability in our country.
Bosida Jelic.
Yes, hello. Since nobody did it, may I just start with a little tribute to Mrs. Gontareva, because I think your impact over the last few years, without wanting
I should introduce Bosida, he's former Deputy Prime Minister of Serbia.
Well, I've been in this transition for 27 years.
And managing director of Lazar Frere, responsible for Eastern Europe.
Thank you. But just to say that for me, you now belong to the top 5, let's say, of the governors in transition, right there with Balcerovic because of the risks. Sometimes it's funny, like in this paper by Taruta, where you're called the wicked stepmother. But sometimes it's much less funny.
You know who called me wicked stepmother?
Yes. So I have been a reformer myself. God knows how tough it is. So really a great salute to a great reformer for the real courage that you've shown. And so I do hope that, like it was the case for Balcerovic, that Ukraine will have the good idea to use your leadership once again in the future. But now back to banking. As has been said here, the job has been brilliantly started. However, you are leaving the battle in the middle of a pretty unsettled terrain. And actually, the question I wanted to ask is the one that Anders asked, but I don't think you really answered this question amongst the many questions you had. And that's pretty simply, who will own the banks in the future in Ukraine? Because Balcerovic and others in Central Eastern Europe had the privilege of having the coincidence of Western Europe being interested in investing. So you could, in a way, subcontract all the tough decisions on to the Vienna or Paris or Milan-based risk committees that nobody could touch from the country, and therefore there was, in a way, a security for the right way of developing the banking, which is not, unfortunately, the case today in Ukraine. So I find that in the debate, people say, well, we'll privatize them. But those things are not going to happen by themselves. We talk to many of the potential shareholders, and many say what was said on this panel, that they will wait for the judiciary system to improve, that they will wait to see some real FDI happen, that they will want to see how the state is managing in the meantime. So the question is, again, who will own? Is it going to be the IFIs, which seems like a first logical step, maybe on a minority share, so as to make sure that the corporate governance is improved? Will you consider maybe talking to the happy or the unhappy ones who are already in the country? Because even though you had some departures, such as UniCredit, you have others, and I don't want to give any publicity to anyone. They are there. They might want to do a bit more under certain conditions. Will you consider the few hedge funds and private equity funds that are investing in Central and Eastern Europe? There are already 5 or 6 deals that have been done. And finally, would you think it would make sense to have a piece on that on the capital markets in Kiev? So I'll stop there. But it's a very important question, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely right, because the question was already asked by Mr. Aslan. Be back to 52% of Ukrainian banking system as a state hands. More to that, 60% of private individual deposits also sit in there. That's why it's absolutely crucial for us right now to create high-level strategy for state banks. And after, because all these state banks should have, proper competition. Right now, it's unhealthy competition. State banks, for example, still could not recognize that PrivatBank, it's already state bank. They still believe that it's very aggressive Ukrainian oligarchs sitting there. It's absolutely not the case. And of course, 2 years ago, together with our former Minister of Finance, Natalia Reska, we already produced strategy for state banks. But right now, this strategy should be rewrite. And central bank already prepare our presentation and our proposal how we'd like because we are a regulator, we are not the owner of this bank. We are not a supervisory board of this bank. But of course, we need to, and we show our vision what we'd like to achieve in 5-year times. In 5-year times, we'd like to decrease the state share of banking sector to 30%, from 52 to 30%. And how to do that? For example, first of all, we need to real good specialization for all these banks. For example, for me, no doubt that private banks should be retail and SME business. I'd like to repeat again, 97% of corporate portfolio of private bank was linked to shareholders. More to that, management of this bank told us, new management of this bank told us, central bank, you were wrong, because 100% of corporate portfolio was dedicated to related parties. That's why, they have absolutely no experience, no background how to build corporate business. That's why for me it's absolutely clear that this bank should focus on SME and retail. And believe me, with their very good advanced technology, it could be a very successful project under the good supervisory board, under the good management, and this should be absolutely good. From my point of view, it's very dangerous, for example, in 5-year times to even to sell this bank to one strategic investor, because it's again will be a monopoly. And my nightmare when I joined central bank in 2014 and observed the monopoly with 33% of private individual deposits, with 50% of transactional business in country which belong to these particular oligarchs. And right now, and we propose, of course, EBRD, NIFC, and other international financial institution to be right now to join this institution, private bank, for example, to acquire about 20-25% of shares, not just to help with capital. It's this bank, it's pretty capitalized. All state banks, it's very good capitalized. But for corporate governance, for the development of strategy, and absolutely for me, it's, for example, IPO or 3 or 4 years or strategic sale. It's again, it's, it's up to all of you, of management board, of supervisory board, to decide what to do if they feel. For example, saving bank, Ukrainians, Ощадный bank, it's a Ukrainian saving bank. It could be universal bank because they already have experience in retail, in SME business, and corporate as well. And again, we invited already EBRD and NIFC to be there, to be among shareholders, and after it could be strategic sale or again IPO as well. For example, export-import bank, it's in all countries, developed countries, all export-import banks, again, it's in state hands, like 100%. But it's again, I'd like to invite, of course, again, all international community to participate, because we need proper corporate governance there and proper strategy.
We can't buy shares in EBRD.
There you go. We certainly need to not replace monopoly of the state on the banking sector by a monopoly of EBRD on the banking sector. so we're not going to invest in all of them. Just to be clear.
I'm more than happy. Your 20% shareholding will only help us, with absolutely good corporate and with strategy and corporate governance. But again, if you'd like me to ask about attractiveness of banking sector in the eyes of international investors, it's not attractive nowhere in the world. And the main idea for all governors of central banks is to create attractive. this sector again. And if all the time we pretend that shadow banking, it's absolutely something not in banking, I can tell you that all these fintech new projects, it's a new way of banking. Yeah. And of course, we need to understand how to implement and how to regulate all of that, like a governance of central bank.
Thank you. I have lots of hands here, and I can't take all, but I'll take 3 together, and then I suggest that the whole panel, starting with Susan, go through and take brief answers all. Miroslava Gongadze. Voice of America.
Thank you very much.
And everybody brief
my question about reforms. You mentioned that land and pension reforms are priorities. How do you see these reforms happening? Because it's a very sensitive issue. As we know, Yulia Tymoshenko and other political parties announced a referendum against the land reform. I would like you to tell us how do you see these reforms proceed and to protect very impoverished Ukrainian society? Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that should be for then be like also Daria Diegut.
My question is.
But you are from Agin plus Agin?
No, RTVI. International
okay.
TV station. So, I have a question regarding the future of PrivatBank under the Ukraine as a state, as an owner, because creditors now taking the country Ukraine to the court, to the London court, and they seek to challenge the exchange of the Eurobonds they had into the additionally issued shares of the bank. So, and in case if the court rules in favor of these investors, what destiny expect like the PrivatBank? And the other question, like a follow-up, a small follow-up, just like about
Thomas Emon Laritin, next. Thomas.
Thomas Malaritas from UPCO. While this panel was taking place, actually, Minister of Finance Alexander Daniluk announced on Bloomberg that he wanted Ukraine to re-enter the financial markets in 2017 and sell emissions of Eurobonds. I'd like to have the reaction of the panelists to see if you think this is something that should be welcomed or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you start, Susan, and comment on whatever you feel like commenting upon, and then if we go the whole line.
Very briefly, I'll start with your question. The IMF has in its most recent report that just was published a couple of weeks ago, that Ukraine, the expectation that Ukraine will enter the international financial markets in the course of 2017. I mean, I think it's a great, I think it's a good, it would be great if it could happen. I think it's a little bit of a stretch to believe that with a high confidence that that can be done in 2017. I'm not saying I don't think it's possible, I just think that's one of the optimistic assumptions that is embedded in the IMF program right now. It could happen, but there are a lot of things between now and the end of the year that could derail those plans.
Francis?
I'd like to come back to a few of the questions around, who's going to invest and who's going to buy and who, at the end of the day, I think the number one task that we're faced now in Ukraine is to build attractiveness for the country. A tremendous job has been done, not just on the banking sector, but also in the energy sector. Laws have been passed, the Naftogaz deficit has been reduced. It's a fight every day, and sometimes I come back from meetings feeling that I'm going to close down my office and start opening a dentist's shop, because as they say in English, it's like pulling teeth sometimes to get some reforms approved. But we are building attractiveness one step at a time. And the other thing that needs to be also taken into account is that if investors are waiting for the risk to be at the Western European level, then the returns are going to be at the Western European levels. And so there's a price for everything. We're certainly not in the 2000s again, where you branded Eastern Europe on anything, any piece of crap, and you would get huge amounts of money coming your way just because it was branded Eastern Europe. So now we need to deliver real value to investors, and that's exactly what we need to build.
Valerie?
A lot of questions. That's
Please.
why the first question about market tap, of course, we support. I think it's time for Ukraine to go to the market, and it's a good idea. But the main idea, of course, for me and for governor and for national bank team to continue work with IMF. We think that it's a real, our EFF, it's not just for money, it's for real reform, for real structural reform. That's why, absolutely, but it should be in parallel. Market and EFF, it should not, you know, to be a substitute of each other. I think it should go in parallel, and it's a very good idea if it goes in parallel. And the second question about bail-in of international investors, Eurobonds, and you know that state pay for nationalization of this bank, absolutely incredible amount of money. I mentioned to you this money comparable with 50% of our monetary base. For you to understand, we'd like to protect our small and medium business, would like to protect pensioners, would like to protect social low layers, would like to protect 20 million Ukrainian small depositors. We never promised to protect international investors, professional investors. It was absolutely clear written in our legislation. This legislation was voted in our parliament in the middle of 2015. It was written there that all other amounts among current account and deposits of private individuals and small business should be bailed in. That's why we nationalized this bank according to Ukrainian law. Even when Eurobond exists according to UK law, we cannot do nationalization of bank according to UK law. We did according to Ukrainian law. According to Ukrainian law, we're obliged to do that, and we did. And I have no doubts that no one court could order Ukraine to nationalize PrivatBank according to UK law. It's my answer.
Stop. Dan, the last word.
Very quickly. I think that if Ukraine is going to go back to the capital markets, that's a sign of health, but I don't think it means clearly to the exclusion of leaving the IMF program. Ukraine now, at this stage, needs the support of its international partners because it is going to embark on probably the most critical and seismic reforms since independence. And the IMF, especially, I'm a fan of the conditionality because it actually strengthens the hands of the reformers inside governments. People tend to treat the Ukrainian government as something monolithic. We have many stakeholders inside the government. We have many stakeholders beside the government. And as a governance issue, we are in this transformation process where, you know, as I tell people, don't come to me with your problems, come to me with your solutions. Because the inability of the government to deal with all the many things that have to happen isn't because it hates you, isn't because it's totally incompetent, it doesn't have the institutional capacity. And this is one of the things that we're dealing with now as well in all of this context. And of the 5 reforms that the Prime Minister announced, pensions, health, education, privatization, and land reform, pensions and land reform are going to be tectonic in their implications. And we need to understand these reforms aren't being done for bondholders, for international investors. They will be beneficiaries, but they're being done for the Ukrainian people. And the transaction costs of this transformation for the Ukrainian people, they have largely borne them. And when we talk about land reform, and I'm involved in the working group that's doing it, so we're very careful. It's something we're doing it side by side with the World Bank. We have lots of advice and expertise, but nobody's done it in a country this size, moving from a Soviet relationship to land to a market relationship to land. There is no room to get this wrong. And so there will be protections for Ukrainian people. There will be a step-by-step phased-in process, but property rights, especially at this elemental level of the Ukrainians' relationship to their property, especially the agricultural land, is absolutely fundamental to driving the economy and sustainable economic growth into the future. Having said that, FDI right now in Ukraine is a matter of national security. It is the only way we are going to go from 2% growth a year to 7 or 8%, which is what we need to drive us forward into a consistent manner. And as Francis said, risk-reward ratios are always relative, and Ukraine is the last frontier market in Europe. It is where you can still make money. And people who come in, they have problems sometimes, but they stay. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Thank you very much, all of you, and in particular Valeria and Darieva. And I would also like to thank Domenico Lombardi and CIGI for excellent cooperation on Ukrainian economic reform. Thank you very much for coming.